Good evening, everyone. I'm Kaashyap Sarma, and I'm here to talk to you about the topic the impact of demonetization on the Indian economy. So, let's venture into the impact of demonetization. So, when we look at the demonetization, the demon in the word demonetization is just in the beginning of a series of events that had ensued over the period of time. Its impact had been greatly felt by every Indian citizen. Demonetization affected the economy through its liquidity side. Its effect would be a telling tale because nearly 86% of the currency value in circulation was withdrawn without replacing any bulk of it. On November 8th, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced in a broadcast to the nations that 500 rupees and 1000 rupees currency note would no longer be recognized as a legal tender. This had been greatly lauded by foreign investors and economic analysts as an excellent move which had been undertaken so far. It was also announced that the new 500 rupee and the 2000 rupee note of the Mahatma Gandhi new series would be introduced in exchange for the old banknotes. So what was the motivation behind undertaking such an act? So the aim behind the government's action was to combat tax cheating, counterfeiting and corruption, which would eventually curtail terrorism funding as well. Eliminating large denominations would make it harder to hide large amounts of cash. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had also noted that the move would complement the country's Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, that is the Clean India campaign. It is also an attempt to reduce the bribery in the black economy so that India may shift toward the digitalized money transfer and a complete cashless economy, which are both more traceable and taxable. This is because only 2.89% of the Indians filed any income taxes in 2013, compared with 45% of the US citizens. Although the majority of Indians' incomes are probably below the tax threshold in the first place, there is without a doubt that India's black market is absolutely huge. That itself, that the World Bank estimated it had to be around 23.2% of the total economy in 2007. Owing to these reasons, the prospectus of demonetization can be said that it was very much well on the table. India has one of the highest cash to GDP ratios in the world, and lubricating economic activity with paper has costs. According to a 2014 study by the Tufts University, the cost of cash in India, cash operations cost the RBI and commercial banks about 21,000 crores eventually. Also, a shift away from the cash would make it more difficult for the tax evaders to hide their income and a substantial benefit in a country that is fiscally constrained. However, the demonetization move was heavily criticized as it was poorly planned and unfair and was met with protests, litigation, strikes, and a lot of flack. By the next day, the demon had started surfacing from the word demonetization. That's because predominantly India is a cash economy. Almost everyone keeps a few 500 rupee note as a nest egg. Lines began forming in front of the ATMs and banks which could not exchange old notes for the new. A mere exchange of the new 500 rupee note for an old 500 rupee note was not enough. There was also a limit imposed on the withdrawals and there was also a limit imposed on how much one could exchange or one could withdraw from their accounts. In some cases, there were altercations as people waited for us. But however, people also wanted smaller currency notes to serve their daily needs. A loaf of bread, which would cost about 25 bucks or something, it was now being sold and exchanged at a rate of 500 rupee buck, as there was no smaller currency note available in the market. So, what were the effects of the demonetization on the Indian economy? If we have to pinpoint a certain number of effects, one would be there was an absence of intermediate denominations like 500 rupee and 1000 rupee note that had greatly reduced the utility of 2000 rupee note. Effectively, this has made the 2000 rupee note less useful as a transaction currency, although it can be sometimes it can be used as a store value denomination. Demonetization is technically a liquidity shock. A sudden stop in terms of currency availability, it creates a situation where a lack of currency jams consumption, which would in turn jam investment, production, and employment. In this context, we can actually see that the liquidity crunch or the liquidity crisis which should ensue from it often leads to solvency crisis for the rural households. The effect of it is seen on a high magnitude in the agricultural sector as cash is the primary mode of transaction, impacting fresh produce and the prices of it. There was also a welfare loss for the currency using the population. That's because most of the active segments of population who would constitute the base of the pyramid would use currency to meet the transactions. The daily wage earners, the other laborers and the small traders, SME workers, they all reside out of the formal sector and they stay in the informal sector and they use a frequent amount of cash daily. These sections had lost substantial amount of income in the absence of liquid cash. Cash stringency will compel the firms to reduce labor cost and thus reduce income to the poor working class. In such a scenario, a wage subsidy could actually be implemented in order to ensure there were no layoffs that can be done and people had still were holding on to the jobs. Consumption has been greatly hit during that particular point of time because when the liquidity shortage strikes, it is the consumption that is going to have a huge impact and it is going to be adversely affected in the beginning. So since the consumption would go down, that would actually imply the production would go down, which in turn would imply that the employment would go down as the production go down. Since the employment would go down, there has been a decline in the growth, which would again lead to a decline in the tax revenues, which would eventually hit the GDP of the country. So one can actually take, the government should have actually taken proper precautionary effects when it comes to when the production of when the production of the commodities or the economy was going down. Employment could have actually been saved by introducing various norms like wage subsidies and other important policies that can be learned from the other nations who have implemented such an act. So when we look at the impact on black money, only a small portion of black money is actually stored in the form of cash. Usually black income is kept in the form of physical assets like gold, land, buildings, etc. Hence, the amount of black money that has been counted by demonetization would depend upon the amount of black money held in the form of cash. And it would be definitely smaller than expected. That's because the RBI had recently revealed that 99% of the currency which has been declared void has been returned back. So this actually proves the fact that very less amount of money which can be considered as black money has been held in the form of cash, whereas it would be held in the form of other physical assets instead of just cash. This move can be taken as more political than economical. It is very hard for any political party to argue with the steps taken against black money. Therefore, it can be indeed considered as Prime Minister Modi's extensive move to actually to put out the fact that either you're with us or you're against us. As much as the cashless economy is greatly beneficial in curbing some of the prevalent grassroots problems, such as financial inclusion, infrastructure, and access of technology and consumer awareness, are some of the factors that need to be consideration and they have to be addressed and tackled at every stage while progressing towards the goal. Short-term effects have to be handled by the government, in fact, by promoting informal sector and taking appropriate policies. A pretension pursuit of less economy to justify a fundamentally flawed act neither recognizes nor solves the twin economic challenge of unequal and jobless economic growth. This was pointed by one of the famous Indian economists. So while we take the dual aspects of both the growth as well as the cons of the demonetization into consideration, one can only say that time can tell whether the worst is over and the long-term effects and the fruits of the demonetization can be reaped, or if a lot of effort is actually required in building up a huge scale infrastructure that should be addressed the current economic challenges it throws for the act to be successful and take India towards a greater formalization with increased transparency and less black money. Thank you.